Chapter 416. Hanged Man Sonny stared at the emptiness for some time, thinking. His new weapon was an ascended one of the 4th rank, which already made it much more formidable than anything else in his arsenal. It was adamantine and sharp as a razor, which would allow him to cut through fallen creatures as if they were made of butter. Well, not exactly, but rather close. Added to that were the considerable reach of its spear form and the incredible swiftness of its sword form. But there was more. The cruel sight was capable of augmenting its attacks with elemental damage. That meant that each wound Sonny would deliver to his enemies would be more dire. Not only that, but the nature of the augmentation could be changed, which meant that if given enough time to prepare, he would be able to exploit the weaknesses of his opponents with the element they were most vulnerable to. He just had to get himself wounded by that same element. Ouch! Everything that was worth it had to hurt a little. Sonny had learned it many years ago. Speaking of which, he sighed, then summoned the cruel sight and held it in his hands for a bit. Then he stood up and walked toward the exit from the cave. As the sound of the waterfall grew louder and louder, he prepared himself. A second later, Sonny entered the field of soul erosion emanated from Saint's armor. Instantly, he felt weak and in pain, as though the very essence of his self was being dissolved by a terrible force. Argy curses. No matter how many times he was subjected to the effect of the broken oath, it was a vile feeling every time. The only good thing about it was that souls, just like bodies, could heal with time, and as long as he did not spend too much time being damaged by the evil memory, he would be able to recover in a day or two. Gritting his teeth, Sonny summoned the runes describing the cruel sight and simultaneously sent essence into its silver blade, activating the dark mirror enchantment. As his contorted face reflected in the polished silver of the elegant sword, nothing about it changed. However, the cruel sight suddenly seemed different, as if an invisible, cold, and sharp aura surrounded its edges. Sonny looked at the description of the dark mirror. Current charge soul. With a relieved sigh, he took a few steps back and escaped the radius of the broken oath. The sensation of his soul being slowly destroyed swiftly disappeared. The runes, however, did not change. Sonny had to feed the memory with a small amount of shadow essence to activate the augmenting enchantment, but its blade would remain entwined with the element of his choice until he charged it with another. A cruel smile appeared on his lips. Just like that, Sonny now possessed a weapon capable of dealing soul damage, the rarest and most insidious type of damage he knew of, one that very few beings out there had any resistance to. In a span of one day, his lethality had grown manyfold. Dismissing the somber sword, Sonny turned around and walked back into the cave. I guess I am the true harbinger of reckoning now. His gloomy shadow lingered for a bit, then scratched the back of its head. For once, it had nothing to add. 2 days later, Sonny was finally approaching Shipwreck Island. Currently, he was on the neighboring one, hiding in the shadow of a collapsed stone tower that had long ago become overgrown with moss. Somewhere behind him, the body of a giant worm-like creature lay on the ground, its body seeping with foul black blood. Sonny had spent a lot of essence jumping through shadows to avoid being devoured by that thing. No matter how many times he had pierced its flesh with his spear, the worm seemed to possess an almost endless amount of vitality. The fact that Sonny had no idea where any of the abomination's vital organs were only made the situation worse. In the end, however, the nightmare creature had succumbed to the damage being continuously dealt to its soul, and now it was dead. Swarms of smaller, but no less repulsive worms were already emerging from the ground to feast on its flesh. Sonny did not care. He had already retrieved the soul shard from the creature's body, and he surely had no plans of using the worm's meat as food. And regardless, his attention was currently concentrated elsewhere. What the hell? The shipwreck island was currently at the height of its ascent phase and loomed high above in the sky. As the result, Sunny was able to see its underbelly, far away in the distance. The downside of the island was shrouded in eternal shadow, and something vast and terrifying was moving in it. The inhabitants of the dark side were all powerful and unsightly, but the thing nesting under that one, in particular, was especially harrowing. Perhaps all islands this close to the tier sheltered such horrors. But even that was not the thing Sunny was looking at. I guess I have my answer. A long time ago, one of the chains connected to Shipwreck Island had broken and now hung down. Entangled in it, a giant iron corpse swayed slowly in the wind. The creature resembled a man made entirely out of metal. The heavenly chain had coiled around one of his legs, so the giant hung with his head down, his face rusted and severely damaged. His powerful chest was caved in and shattered by some titanic blow, and one of his arms was torn away at the shoulder. This was, without a doubt, the creature whose lost limb gave the name to the Iron Hand Island. The dead giant swayed despondently in the wind, producing sounds of rusty metal scraping against the iron of the heavenly chain. Those sounds were loud enough to reach across the gap between two islands and be heard by Sunny in his hiding place. Looking at that humbling sight, Sunny shivered. Who could have killed such a thing? Of course, there was no way to know. Just like always, finding one answer had immediately presented Sunny with a dozen new questions. Nervously shifting his gaze between the hanged giant and the swarm of worms ravenously devouring their elder, Sunny remained hidden in the shadows and waited. Soon, the rattling of chains announced that the shipwreck island was starting to descend. Sunny tensed. It's time. The chain leading to the shipwreck island was about 4 kilometers long, which was on the shorter side by the chained isle standards. As a swift shadow, Sunny would have been able to ride it all the way to his destination in just a few minutes. Sadly, the heavenly chain was currently drawn taut and nowhere near the sky below, which meant that its links weren't covered by a thick layer of shadows. He was going to have to cross it on foot. As the ground behind him started to move, announcing the approach of something far more hungry and terrifying than the swarm of gluttonous maggots, Sunny slid out of his hiding spot, dashed toward the edge of the island, and jumped down. Falling through the vast expanse of the blue sky, he landed on the iron surface of the heavenly chain, rolled down a few meters, and then finally caught his balance. The chain stretched far into the distance, rising higher and higher until it connected with the slowly descending shipwreck island. Unlike how it was with the other pieces of land Sunny had seen in this strange region of the dream realm, the chain didn't simply disappear into the soil, but instead led to a tall stone structure that resembled a castle gate. 2 massive pillars rose high into the sky, overgrown by vines and moss. The gate itself had been broken a long time ago, and now the space between the pillars was empty, the wind passing freely through its vast opening. Further away, the corpse of the iron giant continued to sway in the air, his one remaining hand pointed at the sky below. Summoning the cruel sight, Sunny turned it into the spear and cautiously moved forward. The further he walked, the lower the shipwreck island descended, until finally the heavenly chain became almost horizontal. In about an hour, Sunny crossed the abyss separating 2 isles and approached the stone structure he had noticed from afar. Up close it was even more monumental. He found out that he had been wrong, though. The pillars did not seem like they had ever served to house a massive gate. Instead, they just reached for the sky, built for some unknown purpose. There were weathered steps cut into each of the pillars, leading all the way to the top. Sunny frowned. Who would be crazy enough to climb that high? Even now that the island had descended, up there on top of the monumental pillars the crushing must have been suffocating. With a shrug, he used the dark wing to glide upward and climbed onto a wide stone platform between the pillars. From here, the remains of an ancient road led further into the island. Following it to reach the top of a low hill, Sunny stopped and looked down, at the sight of the peculiar landmark that gave this place its name. At the very heart of the desolate island, a large wooden ship lay broken on the ground. It must have been beautiful and magnificent once, but now, all that remained of its former glory were the fluid lines of the graceful and narrow hull. The ancient wood somehow remained untouched by the passage of time, but the bow of the ship was completely shattered. There were also large breaches here and there along the length of the wreck, and green vines covering large sections of it. What was a ship doing at the heart of a land that had no rivers and no seas remained a mystery, but Sunny became hypnotized by the sight of a crushed vessel for a completely different reason. A triumphant spark appeared in his eyes. "I guess I am in luck today." With a dark smile, he shifted his gaze and looked at the tall mast of the ship. A dead, withered tree coiled around it, its naked branches stretching into the sky like bones. Sunny recognized that tree, even if it looked very different from how it was depicted on the reverse side of the mysterious coins, full of life and in bloom. This was the same ship he had seen before, which meant that the coin might have come from inside the wreck, or at least was connected to it somehow. Initially, Sunny had only planned to scout the vicinity of the island and search for the traces left by the dead chain worm. But now, he felt as if this scouting expedition could actually lead him directly to the treasure he so desperately wanted to find. What were the chances that the coins depicting the strange ship came from somewhere else? Close to zero, most likely. Now he only had to sneak into the wreck, explore it, and return in one piece. Which was not an easy task, considering how close to the tier the island was. Sunny could not see any nightmare creatures moving across its surface, but he knew that there had to be some, and that they were going to be of the truly dreadful kind. Still, he wasn't going to turn back now. "It's worth it." Sunny spent some time observing the island. No matter how hard he looked and how much his shadows roamed around, he couldn't see any abominations anywhere near the ancient ship. That didn't mean there were none, though. It just meant that they were better at hiding than he was at looking. After a while, Sunny frowned and summoned Saint. The taciturn demon stepped out of his shadow a few hundred meters down the slope of the hill and indifferently looked around. Then, she dismissed her bow and instead summoned a melee weapon. The midnight shard appeared in her hands, its austere blade reflecting the black onyx of the shadow's armor. The two suited each other very well. Saint turned her back to Sunny, raised the long tackeye, and calmly headed toward the distant wreck. After 30 seconds or so, he left his shelter and followed, keeping to the shadows. Minute after minute passed in tense silence. Despite his expectations, they didn't meet any powerful abominations. The island was quiet and deserted, covered only by overgrown ruins, vines, and piles of broken wood. When they were halfway to the ship, however, something finally changed. As Saint approached one of the piles of debris, it suddenly moved, and then assembled itself into the shape of a tall, menacing humanoid creature, its hands ending in long, jagged blades. As countless similar piles of splintered wood began to move all around them, Sunny breathed out a curse. It had started so well, damnation. Before the first wood wraith could even fully form, Saint was already upon it. The blade of the midnight shard flashed through the air and bit into the body of the creature with the dull sound of an axe striking the bark of a tree. The effect was somewhat the same. Although she managed to do some damage, the wraith simply ignored the shallow cut and lurched forward, towering above the graceful stone knight with destructive menace. Its hands fell down with crushing force, the wooden blades aimed at Saint's helmet. Wood couldn't cut stone, right? The shadow seemed reluctant to check. She easily sidestepped the creature's attack and thrust upward, driving the tip of the midnight shard into the enemy's neck. Augmented by one of Sunny's shadows, the sword went deep into the adamantine wood. A moment later, the second shadow wrapped itself around the body of the taciturn demon, causing her skin to shine with dark radiance. The coral gem of the broken oath glowed brightly on her black breastplate. Saint twisted her blade and pushed it sideways, causing half of the wood wraith's neck to explode into a rain of splinters. The creature staggered and lashed out with another strike, but it was too late. The shadow calmly shifted her weight from one leg to another and delivered a devastating slash, beheading her enemy. As the wraith fell apart and turned back into a pile of debris, she looked at it indifferently, and then hit the dull side of the midnight shard's blade against her shoulder twice. The voice of the spell whispered, "You have slain a fallen beast, sailor doll. Your shadow grows stronger." Sonny gritted his teeth. Crap! Augmented by two shadows, Saint had defeated one of these dolls without too much problem. However, there were countless more rising from the ground. Sonny counted at least several dozen before losing count. What should I do? Fighting the horde of fallen beasts was clearly suicide. He could either retreat or order Saint to draw their attention away and sneak onto the ship. He could also recall one of the shadows, send it ahead, and then use Shadow Step to travel instantly between his current position and the wreck. But that meant leaving Saint weaker. Decisions. She should be fine for a few minutes, right? Throwing a glance at the taciturn demon, Sonny sighed and dashed toward the ship. Have fun, you three. Saint looked at him, then silently turned away and raised the midnight shard. As Sonny jumped from shadow to shadow, something crashed thunderously behind him. You have slain a fallen beast. But not too much fun. No matter how formidable his demon was when augmented by the shadow and wielding a powerful memory, she was still just an awakened. He had to be swift. As Sonny appeared from a shadow, something massive suddenly lunged at him. Without slowing down, he dove under the blade of another wood wraith, then lashed out with the cruel sight. The silver blade of the sword cut through the body of the abomination, leaving a deep gash on its side. Sonny slid on the moss, escaping from the attack reach of the massive creature. Twisting around, he thrust his sword into empty air. A split second later, however, the hilt of the somber weapon extended, turning it into a long spear. The silver blade pierced the chest of the wood wraith with surprising ease. The sailor doll was still alive, but its soul was damaged. It staggered and took a step forward, driving the spear deeper into its flesh. Sonny tilted his head, then dissolved into shadows and appeared behind the creature. A moment later, the moonlight shard pierced its head. You have slain a fallen beast, sailor doll. Your shadow grows stronger. Sonny retrieved his weapons. You have slain. Saint was busy too. Glancing back, he saw that she was close to being surrounded by a mass of menacing wooden creatures. Not good. Not wasting any more time, Sonny turned away and continued moving toward the wreck. A few minutes later, Sonny reached the broken ship, dove into one of the breaches in its hull, and hid in the shadows. Then he immediately dismissed Saint. Making sure that nothing posed an immediate threat to him, he then quickly checked on the taciturn demon in the Soul Sea. The shadow had received several wounds in the fight against the swarm of wraiths, but none of them were too serious. She was going to have to spend some time restoring herself in the nurturing black flames of the shadow core, still. Rest well, Saint, you deserve it. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then retrieved the memories he had entrusted to her. Who knew what he was going to encounter inside the ancient ship? It was better to be safe than sorry. Looking around, he studied the interior of a small room he had found himself in. Sonny had no knowledge whatsoever of what the insides of a ship were supposed to look like, let alone of an archaic wooden vessel like this one. That was why he couldn't even guess what purpose this cabin had been intended for. All he saw were piles of debris, absolutely mundane, for a change, and thick brown vines covering the walls. The air was stale and murky. It smelled a little sweet. "Oh crap, here we go again." With a subtle shudder, Sonny stared at the strange reddish-brown vines. Those things, without a doubt, were alive. They were also the source of the sweet smell permeating the air that Sonny was currently breathing. What was even worse, they were obviously just a small part of some much, much larger organism. As a strange feeling appeared in his lungs, Sonny sighed, took a piece of cloth from his pack, and wrapped it tightly around the lower part of his face. Blood weaved to the rescue. Let's see what's inside. He only took a few steps when something gleamed on the floor in front of him. Bending down, Sonny picked up the small object and stared at it with a complicated expression. A heavy golden coin rested in his palm. Grasping the coin in his fist, Sonny took a step forward, then cautiously walked around a thick vine sprawled across the floor of the small cabin. Or was it a wall? Since the ancient ship was laying on its side, and at an angle, it was hard to differentiate the floor from the ceiling. The surface beneath Sonny's feet was skewed, forcing him to bend to be able to keep balance. The piles of debris and the vines weren't making things any easier for him. By now, Sonny was almost sure that the vines were a part of a larger creature. His suspicion only grew when he climbed through the narrow doorway and left the cabin. Finding himself in a wide corridor, Sonny felt that the sweet smell permeating the murky air became much stronger. Here, everything was covered by a thick layer of reddish moss, with twisted vines growing through it as they stretched in every direction. Sonny could not help but feel as though he was now inside some giant being, with the wooden carcass of the ancient ship serving as its bones, the moss representing its flesh, and the vines being its veins. The warm breeze that blew through the wreck at rhythmic intervals reminded him of slow breathing of a slumbering giant. It came from somewhere deeper in the ship, bringing with it the sickeningly sweet smell, and then disappeared for a dozen seconds, only to appear again. Let's, not do anything to awaken that thing then. Sonny thought for a few moments, and then decided to keep both shadows wrapped around his body instead of sending them to explore the ship. In situations where a confrontation with an unknown enemy could happen at any moment, having them close by was of paramount importance. At least that approach had saved his life many times in the past. Taking a step forward, he felt the moss spring under his foot and then swayed. His vision blurred slightly. Argh! His worst expectations did not come true. Unlike the blood blossom, the tiny grains of pollen or spores, or whatever it was that he had breathed in, had not tried to take root in his lungs and grow through his flesh. Instead, they simply poisoned him. The poison had entered his lungs, then traveled to his bloodstream, and was now spreading through his body. Sonny could easily see himself losing consciousness and falling to the ground, his body then becoming overgrown by the reddish moss, slowly digested by it, turned into nourishment for the creature that had usurped the wreck of the ancient ship. But he wasn't going to. As soon as the poison entered his bloodstream, Bloodweave went into a frenzy. It seemed to really dislike anything alien invading its territory. Slowly but surely, it went about destroying the toxin. Sonny just had to endure the pain. Summoning the cruel sight, he used the shaft of the spear to help himself keep balance and waited for his vision to become clear again. After a minute or two, Sonny slowly exhaled and continued on his way. A few minutes later, still suffering from pain and weakness, he picked up a second coin from the moss and stared at it for a second. The beautiful person with a crescent moon drawn on their forehead smiled at him with a carefree expression. Sonny frowned in response. "What are you so happy about, fool?" Turning away, he noticed another coin gleaming in the moss a couple of meters further down the corridor. It was almost as if someone left these coins here like breadcrumbs to lead an unsuspecting treasure hunter to their prize. Very convenient. Full of unease, Sonny walked over to the third coin, picked it up, hid it in his pack, and then cautiously moved deeper into the wreck. Soon, he approached a wall with a massive gate barring it. The wooden surface of the wall had cracked and was bent outward, as if something was pressing heavily on it from the other side. The vines out here were especially thick and verticose, shining in the beams of sunlight that fell through a wide hole in the hull of the ship right above. The sweet smell in the air was almost overwhelming. Sonny stared at the warped wall, a grim expression on his face. Although he could not see through it, he could feel the shapes of shadows on the other side. Hidden from him by the thick bulkhead was a much larger, vast and open space. He judged it to be the main cargo hold of the ancient ship. And in it, something massive was moving, slowly expanding and contracting. Brown vines that had devoured the wreck all originated from that place. The sickening breeze that blew through the ancient ship from time to time came simultaneously with the contracting of the massive shadow. Sonny lingered for a while, then decided that he had no desire to disturb the slumber of that being. Instead of trying to open the door, he jumped up, grabbed the edges of the hole above him, and climbed onto the exterior of the ship's hull. He was reasonably sure that a treasure such as miraculous coins would not have been stored in the main hold with the rest of the mundane cargo, anyway. Unless he was absolutely certain that he had no other choice, he was not going to enter it. Sonny was of a rather high opinion about his abilities, but not so high as to forget all fear. That thing inside was not for him to fight, at least not yet. How was he supposed to kill a giant mass of vines and moss, anyway? Instead of trying, he walked on the sloping hull of the ancient ship, carefully avoiding breaches through which thick brown vines were crawling outside, and soon passed the area of the main cargo hold. Now he was approaching the shattered bow of the ship. Out here, the hull was heavily damaged, with most of it being riddled with wide cracks, jagged holes, and splintered boards. The sight of it made Sonny wonder about what had happened to the graceful ship he had seen on the miraculous coins. The vessel was obviously not an ordinary one. Why had it crashed here on that remote island? Why was its bow in such a devastated condition? What had the ship sailed on to begin with? Had it just flown through the skis? If so, maybe the crushing had gotten to it. Feeling that he wouldn't be able to remain hidden in the shadows on this treacherous surface, Sonny crawled back inside and landed softly on the carpet of moss. Just a few steps from where he found himself, several golden coins were gleaming on the ground, with one more laying further down the dark corridor. Sonny cautiously gathered them, then moved deeper into the wreck. It wasn't long before he found the compartment that must have served as the ship's treasury. He knew that there was something special about it instantly, simply for the fact that the floorboards around the heavy door were the only place on the entire ancient ship that was completely free of the reddish moss, the verticose vines, and the air near it was void of the sickeningly sweet smell of the poisonous spores. Standing in front of the door, Sonny smiled. Eureka! Sonny approached the heavily reinforced door and tried to sense if something was moving on the other side of it. There was nothing. It didn't feel as though something dangerous waited for him inside the treasury. On the contrary, with how fresh the air was and how clean the floorboards were, the treasury looked almost inviting. He wasn't entirely convinced, though. Sonny lingered for a bit, then commanded one of his shadows to separate itself from his body and slide under the door. It was going to remain very close, so he was willing to risk weakening himself for a bit. How do I even open this thing? A moment later, Sonny grimaced and covered his face with a palm. When did I become this stupid? Looking through the eyes of the happy shadow, he saw the armored compartment in its entirety. It was a large room, with a high ceiling and 3 heavy chests standing in its center. The entire back wall of the treasury, though, was missing, letting in a flood of sunlight through the jagged edges of a massive breach. Of course it's missing. The chain worm had to have gotten inside somehow, after all. Sonny doubted that the demon could have fit through the door of the treasury, let alone politely lock it behind itself after leaving. He sighed, then shook his head, and decided to attribute this momentary lapse of judgment to the taxing nature of having to endure the pain of being poisoned. No one was there to witness him making a fool out of himself, anyway. Regardless, there was no terrifying nightmare creature laying in wait on the other side of the reinforced door. Nothing was going to attack him if he entered. Sonny considered climbing back on top of the hull of the ship and finding a way to enter through the breach in the back wall of the treasury, then simply stepped through the shadows and appeared inside. He was too excited and impatient to waste any more time. Not to mention that the more time he spent here, the more chances there were of something going terribly wrong. If there were really hundreds of coins in one of those chests, though, that would be a trophy to put all other trophies to shame. A find of a lifetime. Sonny waited for a couple of seconds, letting his eyes adapt to the bright light of the sun, and then studied the 3 chests standing in the middle of the armored compartment. All 3 were open, 2 stood empty but the third. His eyes widened in shock. The third chest was long and adamantine, its dark wood reinforced by strips of dull metal. It was large enough to fit an adult man, and filled to the brim with heavy gold coins. Some spilled out of it and were laying on the floor in a tantalizing pile, showing either the beautiful face of the mysterious charmer or the reverse depicting the ancient ship. Thousands, there are thousands of them. Sonny felt his heart skip a beat and swayed slightly. In front of him was a treasure that would take him all the way to forming a third core, and then some. With this many miraculous coins, Sonny would be able to annihilate the gap between himself and Nephis, maybe even overtake her. This can't be true. He instinctively wanted to think that it had been far too easy, but it wasn't, really. He had almost died while fighting the mirror beast, allowed Saint to be injured in a fight against sailor dolls, walked through the poisonous darkness of the ancient wreck. If it wasn't for the blood weave, he would have been already dead. How many people out there could boast about carrying the legacy of a demon in their veins? For almost anyone else, this trip would have been fatal. Not to mention that very few could have made the series of discoveries and logical conclusions that would lead them here. So no, it wasn't too easy to get to where he was currently standing. It wasn't easy at all. And anyway, Sonny was due for a bit of good luck. Recently, nothing had really gone his way. Take this whole mongrel fiasco, for example, or everything that had happened in the Crimson Spire. The heavy chest stood silently, surrounded by sunlight. The golden coins shined in the bright radiance, inviting him to come and take them. Sonny gulped. This sight was so beautiful, his eyes gleamed with avarice. "Don't mind if I do." Taking several steps forward, he approached the chest. "Gold is heavy. How am I going to carry all of this back to the sanctuary? Damnation. I won't be able to enter the shadows with all that burden too. That is a problem." He reached for the coins, but then stopped suddenly. His hand hovered just outside the invitingly opened chest. Something wasn't quite right. Sonny frowned. "What is it? Maybe I can bury the chest and make several trips. Wait, no, what's wrong here?" His frown deepened. There was no danger inside the treasury, nor was there anything moving outside of it. The terrifying creature that had been slumbering in the cargo hold of the ancient ship was still asleep. There were no sailor dolls wandering nearby, too. So what was disturbing him? The chain worm. The chain worm had swallowed several coins. He also had a piece of the chest in its stomach, the wood splintered, the strips of metal torn. Sonny had even thought how lucky he was that the demon decided to feast on the metal reinforcing the chest and bit a chunk out of it, swallowing the coins in the process. So if he had torn a piece from the chest, why wasn't the chest missing a piece? And what had mortally wounded the chain worm, anyway? Confused, Sonny glanced at the 2 empty chests. They were perfectly whole, with no parts missing. Then he looked back at the large, heavy chest in front of him, his hand still hovering a few centimeters away from the pile of gold inside. The chest had all its corners, too. One of them, though, was of a slightly different color, like a patch of new skin that had grown over a wound and didn't quite match all the rest. Since when were chests capable of healing? What the H? Before Sonny could finish the thought, though, the chest seemed to have sensed his hesitation. It suddenly lurched forward, and as massive jagged teeth suddenly appeared from beneath the gold, its heavy lid closed on Sonny's hand with a sickening sound of breaking bones. As golden coins moved, revealing several rows of terrifying triangular teeth, Sonny recoiled, but it was too late. The heavy lid of the chest suddenly came to life and closed with astonishing speed, another row of fangs appearing from behind its edge. What? Just a fraction of a second before the creature sunk its teeth into his forearm, Sonny's other hand shot forward. The blade of the cruel sight slid between the falling guillotine of the chest's lid and the fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. A moment later, the chest closed, and Sonny screamed. Because of his quick reaction, the creature failed to bite his whole hand off. However, its jaws turned out to be horribly powerful. With a sickening sound, the bones in his arms shattered. Neither the leather vambrace of the puppeteer's shroud nor the augmentation of the shadow managed to resist the terrible strength of the gluttonous chest. Sonny found himself caught in the abomination's crushing maw, with the blade of cruel sight laying flat on top of his broken arm and protecting it from being pierced by the sharp teeth that protruded from the lid of the chest. From below, several triangular fangs were slowly sinking into his vambrace. There was no obvious way to free himself. What the hell is that thing? As several coins fell out of the creature's mouth and rolled on the floor, the chest pressed down harder, making Sonny shriek from blinding pain. "Be bastard! Let go of me, you vile piece of rotten wood!" Instead of doing that, the chest moved closer, forcing Sonny to fall to his knees. Something wet and coarse touched his hand, and a disturbingly long and wide tongue emerged from beneath the golden coins, sliding across his arm and dripping with viscous saliva. Then the tongue moved toward his neck. Sonny stared at the horrid sight in outrage, then screamed. What the spell? As the second shadow wrapped itself around his body, gifting him a vast boost in strength, Sonny tried to pull his broken arm out of the abomination's maw, but its bite was just too damn overbearing. All he accomplished was almost knocking himself out from the pain of bone shards scraping against each other. Arg crap! As the unnaturally long tongue of the chest almost reached Sonny's neck, he growled, and then commanded the cruel sight to turn into a spear. At the same time, he activated the dark mirror enchantment with a burst of shadow essence, imbuing the silver blade with soul-destroying power. The memory extended inside the creature's mouth, hitting it in the back of the whatever it had instead of a throat. The tip of the spear sunk into the adamantine wood only by a centimeter or two. The wound was by no means serious, but it must have hurt the chest a lot because it suddenly let out a shrill shriek and then spat Sonny's maimed arm out. Sonny fell to the floor and rolled away, then rose to one knee. Yes. Before he could celebrate getting his freedom back, however, the chest suddenly swayed and then rose into the air, revealing a gaunt and revolting body hiding beneath. More coins rolled on the floor. The abomination must have been a masterful contortionist, because at its full height, it was almost 3 meters tall. Sonny had no idea how the creature managed to hide all that bony flesh inside the fake chest, even if the chest was large enough to swallow a human whole. Its long and emaciated limbs unfolded with repulsive cracking sounds, and then it towered menacingly above Sonny, the long tongue dripping with saliva. Oh, cursed A! Before he could even react, the creature moved one of its long legs and kicked him in the chest with the force of a derailing train. Sonny's body shot back, smashed through the reinforced door of the armored compartment, and rolled into the corridor outside. He tried to groan, but all the air had been knocked out of his lungs by the terrible collision. His skull seemed to be in one piece, as was his spine barely. It did feel, however, as though his entire body had recently suffered from being stomped on by a whole herd of elephants. In his disoriented state, Sonny couldn't help but think confusedly. Elephant, what the hell is an elephant? Then, however, all thoughts disappeared from his head, because he noticed the vile creature falling on all fours, and then launching itself forward, the lid of the chest rising for another bite. When the abomination landed, though, there was nothing to bite into. Sonny had used Shadow Step and fell out of a shadow 10 meters further into the corridor, then landed awkwardly on his broken arm and whimpered. "Oh damn, that hurts." The toothy chest hovered in the air for a couple of moments, as if bewildered, then slowly turned to face him. Sonny sighed, then picked himself up from the floor and tried to stand up. His first attempt failed. Gritting his teeth and hiding how much pain he was currently experiencing, Sonny threw a furious glance at the creature and growled, "Come here, you bastard." With that, he used the cruel sight to help himself stand up, and then pointed the spear at the creature. The chest tilted to the side. How come it seems as though the bastard is grinning? How can a chest even grin? But there was no mistaking it. The abomination was mocking him. It became especially apparent after a grating, high-pitched giggle escaped from somewhere inside it. The sound of it was so offensive, both to Sonny's pride and his ears, that he would rather have his arm broken all over again than listen to it. "Funny, is it?" Sonny smiled, then unhurriedly lowered the spear and thrust it into one of the thick brown vines sprawled on the floorboards in front of him. The abomination's giggle abruptly stopped. It froze and stared at Sonny, as if utterly stunned. And then trembled. "Not so funny now, huh?" A moment later, the entire ship trembled too. Whatever it was that slumbered in the cargo hold of the ancient ship did not like one of its vines being damaged, let alone having its soul cut by a sharp blade. As the whole wreck trembled, a strong gust of warm, pungent wind hit Sonny in the back, tousling his hair. The air became even murkier than it had been before. The chest creature froze, staring at him with something that resembled a mortified expression. Even its tongue stopped swaying in the air and retreated back under the pile of golden coins. Now it was Sonny's turn to grin. An evil gleam appeared in his eyes. Retrieving the cruel sight, he said, "Goodness gracious, how clumsy of me." The abomination lingered for a few moments, gave him a hateful look, and turned slightly toward the door of the treasury. Then, however, it halted. "Don't tell me." Faced with the terrible danger of facing the awakened master of the wreck, the creature was still hesitating. The prey was right in front of it. To Sonny's misfortune, he and the bizarre monstrosity shared one fundamental character flaw. Both were very, very greedy. Before he could even blink, the abomination suddenly turned back and lunged at him with a shrill giggle rumbling from somewhere in the depths of it. All Sonny could do was spend more essence and use Shadow Step again, appearing on the spot where the creature had been a second ago. As he slipped on the debris of the shattered door and fell, the abomination shot through the air and crushed into the wall of the corridor, pulverizing the wooden boards and getting entangled in the vines covering them. It huffed and puffed, then tried to extricate itself from the mess of glistening vines. However, they wouldn't let go. In fact, as Sonny watched in horror, the whole corridor moved. The reddish-brown mass that it was overgrown with rippled, and the thick vines crawled toward the trapped creature, long thorns suddenly appearing on their vernicose surface. The abomination giggled again, this time nervously, and doubled its efforts to free itself, slashing at the vines with its talons and biting into them with its terrifying teeth. As sickeningly pungent juice flowed into its maw, the creature shuddered. "Crab, crab, crab." Turning on his stomach, Sonny lunged himself forward and rolled into the treasury. Here, there were no vines and no moss, only two empty chests and a scattering of gold coins gleaming on the floor. As he hesitated, thinking of what to do next, something crashed with a deafening noise in the corridor behind him, and a moment later, the tall silhouette of the gaunt monstrosity appeared in the doorway. Sonny's eyes widened, and he brandished the cruel sight, preparing to defend himself. The abomination, however, did not pay him any attention anymore. Jumping over Sonny, it landed in the middle of the armored compartment, and then ran as fast as it could toward the breach in the back wall. Without stopping even for a second, it reached the breach and dove through it, escaping the awakening wreck. Sonny followed its escape with his eyes and then blinked. Ugh. Then his gaze fell on the floor of the treasury. The coins were still there, glinting in the bright sunlight. They didn't disappear or dissipate after the creature had run away. The coins were real. They're real. As the ancient ship shook and trembled, and the mass of vines crawled toward the treasury, Sonny gritted his teeth and lunged toward the coins, grabbing them and pushing them into his pack. Real, they're real. He was in such a hurry to gather all the coins that he even cut himself slightly on the piece of mirror that was still stored in the pack. Ouch! If these coins are real, then the rest of them inside that damned chest are real too. Perhaps there weren't as many as he had thought, since the chest turned out to have a false everything, but just the top layer that was visible to the naked eyes had to contain 1,000 or more coins at least. As Sonny hunted down the last shiny golden disc left in the treasury, his attention was elsewhere. It was concentrated on his shadow, the one he had hidden in the abomination's own shade when it jumped over him. Now, the shadow was following the bizarre creature as it ran toward the edge of the island, its gangly arms swaying in the air. Sonny expected it to be assaulted by the sailor dolls, but the menacing wood wraiths seemed to be retreating from the wreck themselves. Some even dropped to the ground, turning back into piles of debris. The ground was moving. Well, what do you know? He thought that the dolls learned to fall apart and reassemble themselves as a way to combat the crushing, since many nightmare creatures on the Isles had adapted to its harsh reality in one way or another. But maybe this peculiar ability had initially been just the means to hide themselves from the being that inhabited the wreck. In any case, he couldn't let the chest escape, not when 1,000 shadow fragments were hidden inside the abominable thing. Palming the last coin, Sonny threw the pack over his shoulder, then picked up the cruel sight and stood up. A determined expression appeared on his face. The abomination was already halfway to the edge of the island. "Where are you running, bastard?" Diving into the shadows, he expended a large burst of essence and appeared out of his own shadow right in front of the creature. Since he could only use one hand now, the weapon memory had turned back into a short sword. Before the abomination could react, the cruel sight lashed out and bit it into its thigh. The silver blade went all the way through, escaping from the back of it in a rain of black blood. The chest let out a startled shriek, and then the monstrosity tumbled to the ground, rolling over its head and sending pieces of moss and mud flying into the air. The force of its crash was so fearsome that the ground trembled. Or was there another reason? Before Sonny could do anything, brown vines shot from under the moss, wrapping themselves around the body of the bizarre abomination. One of them, however, slid around his leg instead. Not good. The vine wasn't as large as some of the ones Sonny had seen back on the ancient ship, but it was still as thick as a man's arm, with curved black thorns protruding from its glistening surface. The vine brought the sickeningly sweet smell with it. Sonny hacked at it with the cruel sight, but barely managed to break the vine's skin. As a fine aerosol of aromatic juice shot into the air, the damned thing moved. His eyes widened. The vine easily shredded the leather boot of the puppeteer's shroud, as if the awakened armor of the fifth tier was made out of tissue paper. Before the sharp thorns could saw off his foot, however, Sonny cursed and brought the cruel sight down once more, this time augmenting the silver blade with both of his shadows. The short sword hacked through the vine, severing the stretch of it that was wrapped around Sonny's leg. The rest of it didn't like being cut one bit. Surging forward, it aimed at his torso. Several more appeared from beneath the moss and shot at Sonny, too. However, now that nothing was holding him, he could finally use Shadow Step again. Before the vines reached his body, Sonny turned into a shadow. Safe and sound in their tranquil embrace of the darkness, for now, at least he slid a few meters away and stared at the struggling abomination. The creature was entangled by several thick vines, which moved across its body, leaving bloody trails on it. Sparks flew as the black thorns scraped fruitlessly across the adamantine surface of the wooden chest, though. It seemed to be much tougher than the rest of the creature's body. The monstrosity gathered its limbs underneath it, then pushed with all its might, trying to stand up. An angry shriek escaped from its maw. The vines were trying to hold it down, but either they were much weaker here, far away from the wreck, or the abomination was much stronger than Sonny had thought. It raised to its knees, then lashed out with its talons, ripping two of the vines apart. Suddenly liberated, the monstrosity crawled from underneath the remaining vines, and then dashed toward the edge of the island on all fours. Sonny hissed. "Crap! Why couldn't it just lay still and die?" He escaped the shadow and ran after the unreasonably swift abomination, but it was too late. Just a few moments later, the bizarre creature reached the very edge of the island and jumped off of it without slowing even for a moment. The lid of the chest clicked close as it plummeted down. What the hell? Sonny reached the edge a few seconds later and froze as he looked down. A grim expression appeared on his face. Some distance below, a gargantuan heavenly chain escaped from the mouth of a stone structure similar to the one Sonny had seen on the other side of the island. This one was slightly different, though, mainly because both of the massive stone pillars had broken and collapsed a long time ago. The chain itself was different, too. Sonny had never seen such a thing on the chained isles. It seemed sick, somehow, weakened. The chain was covered in rust, its iron links dim and lifeless, robbed of their usual sense of indestructible stability. This one was rather long, stretching for good 10 kilometers or so into the distance. Because the shipwreck island continued to descend, it was slightly angled upward. Sonny could see a relatively small isle on the other end of the chain, far into the distance. And everywhere in between, grotesque chainworms were crawling all over the weakened heavenly chain. Now that Sonny saw them alive, he understood that he had underestimated just how disturbing these creatures were. With their long serpentine tails, human-like torsos, and long muzzles that brimmed with dagger-like fangs, the demons looked like misshapen maggots devouring the dying chain. Or maybe it was already dead, and they were simply feasting on its corpse. Some were thin like the one Sonny had seen before, some engorged on the rusty iron and bloated beyond any reasonable measure, towering above the damaged chain like small hills of flesh. The scales on the latter ones looked like they were now made out of steel and shined as they reflected the sunlight. Those who had not satiated their hunger yet were much thinner and flew around, resembling giant metal dragonflies. Crap! The damned chest creature landed directly on the rusted heavenly chain, gathered its long limbs, and dashed away from the shipwreck island, swaying dangerously as it went. From time to time, it fell to all fours and launched itself into the air, jumping from one link to another. It wasn't long before the bizarre abomination encountered a chain worm. The winged creature lunged at it, only to be kicked in the muzzle and have one of its wings ruthlessly torn apart. The chest creature tossed the maimed chain worm back toward the island, where its body was suddenly grabbed by a long root that lazily extended from the darkness of the dark side, then disappeared from view. The abomination took in the terrible sight, giggled, then turned around and continued running away. Sonny hesitated. His prize was getting away, but the small island he could see in the distance had to be the twisted rock, the isle directly bordering the tier. There would be no more land to escape to if he went there. And the only chain that connected Twisted Rock to the chained isles was currently being devoured by the demonic worms. It didn't seem to be on the verge of collapse just yet, however. How would Sonny know? It's not like he had seen a heavenly chain break before. Perhaps it was time to give up on his pursuit and turn back. He lingered on the very edge of the island, sensing brown vines crawling closer and closer. Risk it all or retreat and lose the chance to get his hands on the miraculous treasure forever. Nephi's was about to become a devil in just a few days. No matter what decision he was going to make, he had to make it right now. In the end, Sonny had to silence his avarice and consider the situation objectively. Going after the bizarre abomination posed a huge risk, but it also promised a huge reward. In the end, what made him decide was not greed, emotions, or even rational thought. It was his intuition. For whatever reason, Sonny felt a strong aversion to the idea of turning back. It was as though Twisted Rock exerted an invisible pull on him, drawing him closer. He had never experienced something like this, at least not to this degree. He knew that his intuition was not a simple thing. It was connected to the faded attribute and the special properties his eyes had inherited from Weaver. Somehow, Sonny was capable of perceiving the trembling of the strings of fate around him from time to time. Considering how strong his intuition was pushing him toward the Twisted Rock, something out there had to be of utmost importance to his fate, or at least have a connection to it. Fine, let's get those coins. With a grim expression, Sonny summoned the dark wing and dove into the empty abyss of the skis. Sonny glided through the skis, tensely observing the underside of the shipwreck island through the eyes of his shadow. The chain ahead of him was teeming with a swarm of fallen demons, but behind him, he didn't even want to know what the thing hiding in the darkness was. One thing became clear, though, and it was why none of the chain worms had tried to devour the iron giant that swayed in the wreckage of a broken heavenly chain, or rather, had succeeded in trying to bite a piece out of him. The dead colossus was like cheese in the mousetrap, attracting these vile creatures into the range at which the being that dwelled in the perpetual darkness could catch them. Sonny was sure that many chain worms had attempted to feast on the iron giant, but ended up being the feast instead. Currently, he was trying to avoid the same fate. Luckily, the dark wing allowed him to glide diagonally away from the shipwreck island instead of plunging straight down, avoiding the attack range of the terrifying being. He reached the chain without attracting the attention of the bottom dweller and instantly became a shadow, hiding on its underside. Waiting for a few moments, Sonny studied the length of the heavenly tether in front of him. Not too bad. A large section of the unusually long chain hung low, reaching the sky below. He would be able to ride most of it without being noticed by the chain worms. The last stretch of it, though, Sonny was going to have to use Shadow Step to jump from shadow to shadow if he wanted to avoid having to fight a swarm of the fallen demons. The problem was that his reserves of Shadow Essence were already running low. Except for the short walk across the hull of the ancient ship, Sonny had no chance to really replenish it. In the meantime, he had used a lot to get to the wreck, fight the damnable chest abomination, and pursue it. Chances were he would reach the Twisted Rock with no essence to spare whatsoever. How was he even going to kill the vile chest, especially with one of his arms broken? He hesitated for a bit, then rushed forward, swiftly reaching the section of the chain submerged into the sky below and continuing to fly through the darkness once there. To avoid tempting fate, Sunny remained on the underside of the gargantuan tether, where there were way fewer worms crawling around. He did, however, encounter several, and saw up close how they were tearing into the rusting iron of the chain as he silently flew past. The sight of it was simultaneously disturbing, fascinating, and strangely sad. All things must come to an end, I guess. Even those as seemingly eternal as the miraculous heavenly chains. As soon, he caught up with the chest creature and followed it from the shadows. The bizarre monstrosity was still running as fast as it could, jumping from link to link, and using its long, gangly limbs to keep balance. From time to time, it got into a short and vicious fight with one of the chain worms and either left them severely wounded, or promptly escaped with a ghastly wound or two of its own. By now, its grating giggles grew somewhat miserable, as well as menacingly angry. Sunny observed its fighting habits, thinking about how to deal with it best. At the same time, he was meticulously calculating the amount of shadow essence he would have to spend across the last section of the way to the twisted rock, trying to find a way to keep his reserves as high as possible. His calculations, though, had turned out to be for naught. When both Sunny and the chest monstrosity were about halfway to the small island, a dreadful sound reached their ears. It was the rattling of the chain. Sunny froze for a moment, then glanced toward the goal of this journey. Oh no! The twisted rock had entered its ascent phase, and was now rising quickly into the sky. Curse it all! Sunny remembered thinking that he was in luck today, and couldn't help but growl mentally, of course, since he had no vocal cords currently. Where the hell was this supposed luck? The fact that the twisted rock was ascending meant two things for him. One was that he would have to act fast and try to kill the chest creature before the crushing became too terrible, or somehow obliterate the damned thing while being weighed down by it. The second was that the position of the heavenly chain was swiftly shifting, making it so that the stretch of it submerged into the sky below was becoming shorter and shorter. This meant that he would have to spend much more essence to reach the island without attracting the attention of the swarm of chain worms, and he didn't have a lot of essence to spare, to begin with. Damn it! As the angle of the chain increased and the bizarre monstrosity swayed, then fell on all fours and rushed forward even faster, Sunny tried to deal with the resentment growing in his heart and followed it. Was my intuition wrong? Things didn't seem too good for him right now. Soon, the two of them emerged from the darkness of the sky below and saw the sunlight again. The chest creature seemed indifferent to it, but to Sunny, it was an ill omen. Out here in the sunlit expanse of the sky above, the heavenly chain was not covered in an uninterrupted layer of shadows anymore. That meant that he couldn't move through it unobstructed. Instead, Sunny had to either step from one shadow to another if they were close enough, or send his own forward and make use of it to jump over long stretches of brightly lit parts of the heavenly tether. Damn it! Knowing that there was no other choice now, Sunny burned through his essence in order to not fall behind the rushing monstrosity. Soon his reserves grew dangerously low. It was still enough to reach the twisted rock, probably, but once there, he would have to fight while both of his cores were nearly empty. That meant no bursts of speed, strength, and resilience that he had already gotten used to. No access to active enchantment like the Dark Mirror. No more using Shadow Step to escape dangerous situations, at least for a while. And added to all that, one of his arms was broken and completely useless. Oh, and there was also the crushing. If Sunny had teeth in his shadow form, or a mouth, for that matter, he would have gritted them right now. Full of dark emotions, he thought. Doesn't matter. I'm getting these coins even if it kills me. Soon, the vile creature drew close to the twisted rock. It crouched near the vertical stone wall of the floating island, giggled, and then suddenly shot upward, jumping no less than 20 meters high. Its talons pierced the weathered stone, and the abomination nimbly climbed up, soon disappearing from view. Far below, on the rusted surface of the damaged heavenly chain, a hunched human figure suddenly appeared from the deep shadows. Sunny felt the chain sway as the island rose higher and higher, then looked up with a dark expression. In this direction, Twisted Rock was the last piece of land before the empty expanse of the tier. It also only had one iron tether connecting it to the rest of the chained isles, so now that the bizarre monstrosity was up there, it had nowhere else to run. With a pained grimace, Sunny summoned the Moonlight Shard, cut one of the straps off his pack, then tied it around his neck to create a makeshift sling for his broken arm. He was going to have to set the bones and make a proper splint later, but for now, this was going to have to do. With his arm secured and cradled against his chest, Sunny waited a few seconds for the sharp pain to subside, then activated the dark wing and used the prowling thorn to fly up the overhanging slope of the stone island. The dragonfly cloak only allowed him to levitate if there was a surface beneath it to support the enchantment. If there wasn't, he was only able to slowly glide down instead of falling without any control. So, to travel up, he had to either push off of something or pull himself towards something. The prowling thorn made that process easier. Due to the burden of the early stages of the crushing, Sunny had to exert more strength than usual to propel himself upward. After using the heavy kunai to do so several times, he finally crested the edge of the Twisted Rock and soared a few meters above it. The Twisted Rock was a dreadful and miserable place. The island was rather small, and all of its surface was nothing but an uneven expanse of dark stone. That stone, however, looked really strange. It was as if once, a long time ago, it had been melted by unimaginable heat and then abruptly solidified again, creating strange shapes and swirls. Here and there, blackened bones protruded from the molten stone, telling the tale of countless humans and beasts who had drowned in that scorching inferno. The sight of them was eerie and disturbing, like something torn from the actual hell. Thrown down by the crushing, Sunny landed heavily on the dark stone and swayed, then supported himself with the shaft of the cruel sight. His graceless arrival made enough noise to attract the attention of the chest fiend, who was crouched a dozen or so meters away. The creature froze, then turned around and faced him. Sunny scowled. A mangled corpse of a chain worm was hanging from beneath the half-closed lid of the chest. As the creature turned, the tail and claws of the dead fallen demon scraped across the molten stone. The bizarre abomination stared at Sunny for a few moments, then opened its maw and swallowed the remainder of the chain worm whole. Despite the fact that the demon was at least 5 times bigger than the chest that served the fiend as the head, it somehow disappeared inside without leaving a trace. The creature licked the blood off its sharp teeth and giggled. This time, its laugh sounded rather hateful. A cold smile appeared on Sunny's lips. "Right back at you, bastard." As the fiend rose to its feet, towering above Sunny menacingly at its full 3 meters of height, the cruel sight shifted and turned into a somber shortsword. Its silver blade gleamed, seemingly absorbing the bright sunlight. The heavenly chain rattled below, and as its rusted links scraped against each other, the Twisted Rock continued to ascend. The smile disappeared from Sunny's face. Staring at the gluttonous abomination, he couldn't help but feel a bit of fear. The thing was tall, fast, and incredibly strong, much stronger than he was, especially now that his reserves of shadow essence were almost completely drained. Despite the fact that it was heavily wounded, both by his sword and by the claws of the chain worms, it still appeared agile, vigorous, and full of murderous spite. However, this fight was not going to be as suicidal as it might have seemed. There were 3 main reasons why Sunny felt confident in his chances of defeating the bizarre abomination. The first one was hanging on a thread tied around his neck. It was a beautiful amulet in the form of a crimson flower, the blood blossom. The fiend was bleeding heavily from the deep cut on its thigh, which had been left there by the sharp blade of the cruel sight, and from a multitude of ugly wounds delivered to the gaunt body of the monstrosity by the chain worms it had fought while traversing the heavenly chain. The more black blood flowed from those wounds, the more the morbid charm memory enhanced both the puppeteer's shroud and the cruel sight, as well as any other memory Sonny would want to use. The second reason was rather simple, and it was the fundamental difference between the two of them. The abomination might have been stronger and faster than Sonny, but it lacked his combat skill and insight. As long as the gap in power was not absolutely overwhelming, a polished technique could turn the tide of any battle. More than that, fighting things that were bigger and more powerful than him was more or less Sonny's specialty by now. However, the third reason was the most important, and the one he hoped to exploit the most. Yes, the fiend was stronger than Sonny, but it was also much larger and heavier than him. That meant that it was going to be affected by the crushing much more. No matter how bad it was going to get for Sonny, it was going to be many times worse for the towering abomination. Out here on the chained isles, being small and lithe was sometimes a great advantage. Feeling the burden of the crushing pressing down on him more and more, Sonny raised his sword and aimed it at the bizarre fiend. Let's see which one of us is going to break first. The fiend shifted its weight, then lunged forward with a shrill giggle. It was terrifyingly powerful and fast, but because its movements were clearly telegraphed, Sonny had plenty of time to react. Diving under the long arm of the abomination, he narrowly avoided being torn apart by the sharp talons and lashed out with the cruel sight. As the silver blade bit into the abdomen of the creature, piercing its tough skin just under the ribs, he continued forward and spun. Just a split second later, Sonny was already behind the enemy. However, he wasn't safe. Without pausing even for a moment, the bizarre monstrosity pressed its hands against the ground and then kicked back with both legs. There was enough power in that strike to shatter a small hill, but Sonny was already moving, getting out of range. He had not observed how the fiend fought against the chained worms for nothing. He knew that the wretched thing could use all four of its limbs to attack, and that its joints seemed to be able to bend in any direction. Not only did he know what the abomination was capable of, he also knew what it liked and tended to do. He also knew where it was most vulnerable, and where none of his weapons would be able to do any harm. That's why he had aimed for its gaunt body instead of the much larger and obvious target, the chest itself. Sonny had always been very perceptive, and practicing shadow dance only sharpened his ability to observe and understand such things. Maybe it was thanks to that he had managed to learn so much about the fiend so fast. As the soles of his boots scraped against the dark stone, a fleeting thought passed through his mind. How would it feel to shadow a nightmare creature, I wonder? Then he had no more time for unnecessary thoughts. Crushing through blackened bones, the abomination bent its joints in the opposite direction of where they were supposed to turn, spun, and lunged at him once again. This time, it was moving on all fours, the lid of the chest serving as its lower jaw. That made it almost impossible for him to dodge out of the way. Sonny had no idea why the golden coins weren't spilling out, but luckily, they seemed to be held in place by some strange force. Unable to use his maimed arm to help himself keep balance, he had no choice but to jump down and roll under the attacking fiend. The cruel sight flashed again, leaving a deep cut on the leg of the creature. At the same time, a pulse of sharp pain radiated through Sonny's entire body. Even though he took care to protect his broken bones, he couldn't keep them from scraping against one another completely. But the worst pain was still to come. That is going to hurt. Sonny had already known that he would not be able to get back to his feet before the next attack came, due to the fact that the abomination would have to perform it from an awkward position. It was not going to be as devastating as the previous blows. The crushing had also become considerable enough to slow down both of their movements. But those long and sharp talons were absolutely deadly, even if there was not much force behind them. As the fiend pivoted and snapped one of its limbs in his direction, Sonny sent both of his shadows from his body to encompass the puppeteer's shroud. A moment later, the talons slashed across his torso and slid from the lusterless black leather of the chest guard without piercing it. The strike itself, however, was still powerful enough to throw Sonny flying back. He counted on that, though, and used the momentum to create distance between himself and the vile creature. Landing on his feet, Sonny suppressed a groan and brandished the cruel sight once again. As the heavenly chain rattled, Twisted Rock rose even higher, and the burden of the crushing suddenly pressed him down even more. Some time later, Sonny was on the verge of passing out from exhaustion and pain. "Arg, curse you!" He staggered back and hunched over, using the shaft of the cruel sight to keep himself standing upright. His breath was ragged and pained, and drops of both sweat and blood were rolling down his face. Things were not going great. For the both of them, actually. The ferocious clash between himself and the vile, giggling fiend had gone for much longer than either of them had ever expected. After the first few minutes, it had become apparent that neither one could easily kill the other. Sonny was too devious and slippery to be caught by the bizarre creature, and the damned chest monster was too vigorous and resilient to succumb to the dozens of shallow wounds that Sonny had delivered to it. What's worse, all of its vital organs seemed to be hidden inside the chest, which was nearly indestructible. It was the most terrible battle of all. A battle between two cockroaches. As the result, their fight lasted for a simply stupid amount of time. By now, both were in rough shape. Sonny was almost dead from exhaustion, bleeding from several ugly wounds, and in a world of pain. The abomination looked even worse. Its gaunt body seemed to have gone through a meat grinder, and its long tongue was hanging lifelessly over the edge of the chest, not even trying to move. Neither was ready to give up, though. The fiend panted heavily and stared at Sonny. Then it giggled once again. This time the giggle sounded tired, slightly bewildered, but mostly full of searing hatred. The bastard really wanted to rip Sonny to shreds now. Staggering forward, it tried to swipe at him with one hand, but crashed heavily to the ground instead. Lying there motionlessly, the bizarre creature let out a despondent growl. The crushing was almost unbearable by now. Sonny wasn't sure that he would be able to withstand it for much longer, so the abomination had to be having an extremely rough time, too. In fact, it was certainly being tortured by the oppressive force much more. Very soon, both of them were going to be completely immobilized. He just had to kill it before that happened. Not sure that he would be able to take another step, Sonny extended the cruel sight to its full length and thrust it forward. The silver blade pierced the skin of the fiend, causing more black blood to seep out. "Good, bleed to death, you piece of crap." He could feel the enhancement of the blood blossom become a tiny bit stronger, but at this point, it was already meaningless. The charm was just an awakened memory of the second tier after all. Whatever boost it could provide was not that substantial when dealing with fallen nightmare creatures and ascended weapons, especially past the point where the incremental increases in its potency were truly substantial. The abomination tried to dodge the attack, but failed to move fast enough due to the merciless pressure of the crushing. It tried to stand up, but failed. A grim smile appeared on Sonny's face. "Got you." His enemy, it seemed, was now completely helpless, but Sonny could still move, he could still attack. He had not even used any of the shadow essence that had been accumulating in his cores this whole time. The reserves weren't large, but there was some. Retrieving his spear, he gathered his strength, and then thrust it forward again, delivering another wound to the bizarre creature. And then again, and then. "Die, just die already." And then the fiend giggled mockingly and suddenly gathered its limbs, which then disappeared into the bottom of the chest. A few seconds later, the whole body of the creature was out of sight, leaving only the adamantine, indestructible chest standing in the middle of the stone island. The tip of the spear scraped against the dark wood, not leaving even a scratch on it. Sonny stared at it, dumbfounded. Then he let out a yelp, and as the power of the crushing increased even further, fell to his knees. "What the hell? Come back here, you coward!" His hands trembled from strain as he lifted the cruel sight and struck the chest once again, to no result whatsoever. Sonny seemed to have overexerted himself with that last strike, because the spear fell out of his hands and plunged to the ground, striking the stone with enough force to send a few cracks through it. Then it bounced and rolled away, finally getting caught on a piece of bone about 2 meters away. He stared at the cruel sight with a shocked expression, and then dismissed the memory instead of trying to walk or crawl that far to retrieve it. Sonny turned to the chest and gritted his teeth. A moment later, sparks of light appeared around his hand again. "Don't think that it's over." The lid of the chest trembled and then rose a bit. The creature clearly strained to achieve even that much. A gloating, hateful giggle emerged from the depths of it a moment later. That was the exact moment when Sonny tossed a polished crimson gem that had appeared in his hand toward the chest. Just a split second after the broken oath flew inside the abomination's maw, the lid snapped close, pressed down by the obliterating force of the crushing. A muffled sound resounded from within the chest, but no matter how much the lid trembled, it didn't rise again. Sonny fell to the ground and laughed, then groaned and whimpered as he arduously crawled a few meters away, and finally grew still just outside of the broken oath's soul-destroying reach. Laying there in complete exhaustion, unable to move any more, Sonny grinned. "Who's laughing now? Try to swallow that, you bastard." The twisted rock soared higher and higher into the sky, and as it did, a terrible crushing force assaulted the 2 living beings that were pressed into its surface, separated only by a dozen meters of dark stone. The large adamantine chest did not look too good. The wood was slowly losing its color. The strips of metal reinforcing it showed growing patches of rust. It seemed as though the creature was struck by some terrible disease. In a sense, it was. After all, the broken oath was currently destroying its soul bit by little bit. Sonny did not look that much better, though. He was laying on the hard stone, looking at the merciless skis, struggling to breathe and endure the pain. His armor was soaked in blood, and his broken arm was pressed tightly against his chest. His face was deathly pale, almost the same color as the tall and majestic ivory tower that floated high above the world, shrouded in the whitest of clouds. Every breath was a torture. Sonny knew that he was not going to bleed to death because of the blood weave, but the wounds still needed to be tended to. His broken bones, especially, were in need of attention. This crushing was turning out to be tragically long, though, not giving him the chance to do so. Well, that was not a surprise. The single chain connecting the twisted rock to the rest of the isles was much longer than most, which meant that the small island was going to rise very, very high, higher than Sonny had ever been in this strange and deadly land. The crushing was not only going to last longer, but would also be vastly more terrible than the few previous times he had experienced it. By now, the hours of hardship he had endured together with Master Roan several days ago seemed like a pleasant walk in the park. Now it seemed as though he was being slowly crushed under the weight of the entirety of heaven. Sonny was only alive because he didn't have to hide his powers anymore and could use all of his abilities without restraint. Unlike on the day he had met the dashing Griffin rider, both shadows were now tightly wrapped around his body, augmenting its resilience threefold. For that reason, he had not turned into a puddle of bloody goo yet, although it certainly felt as though he was getting close. If things became really unbearable, He could still escape into the shadows and either wait out the worst part of the crushing or try to escape back to the heavenly chain before his shadow essence ran out. Since he had spent this whole time patiently circulating it through the coils of the soul serpent, there was a considerable amount flowing through his cores by now. He had also spent this whole time waiting for the damn chest fiend to finally die, as well as considering his options on how to transport the gold coins back to the sanctuary of Noctis. Since it had turned out that only the upper layer of the treasure pile was real, he now had much more options. However, all of them required him to burn through a lot of essence to cross back through the swarm of chain worms. The problem was confounded by the fact that Twisted Rock was going to be destroyed soon, which meant that he could not risk making several trips to the Citadel and back. He had to carry his spoils away, while the island was still attached to the rest of the chained isles. For that reason, Sonny was trying to endure as much of the crushing as he could before turning into a shadow. He also did not forget about the strange way his intuition had reacted to the dying island. Before the burden of the crushing became too overbearing, he had sent one of his shadows to scour the whole place in search of anything that might have been important enough to affect the strings of fate. However, there was literally nothing on the Twisted Rock except for barren stone and ancient, blackened bones. The shadow explored every nook and cranny of this miserable place, only to find nothing at all. He had even sent it to take a look at the underside of the small isle, but it was as empty and desolate as the rest of it. Sonny was left very confused by that turn of events. He was certain that there was nowhere on the Twisted Rock that he had failed to search, and yet there was nothing on the island to cause his intuition to react so strongly. What was going on? Had he failed to notice something, or was he mistaken about the whole thing to begin with? Sadly, after a while, the crushing had become too terrible for him to endure without the help of the second shadow, so he had to call it back. And now here they were. A sudden sound attracted Sonny's attention. Glancing sideways, he noticed that a crack had appeared on the surface of the adamantine chest. Black blood seeped out of it, soon turning into a stream. A few seconds later, a second crack appeared near the first. He would have smiled if not for the fact that even such a simple action was rather strenuous now, this high above the sky below. It's not going to be too long now. A few minutes later, there was a pool of black blood surrounding the large wooden chest. Sonny endured the pain and counted the seconds. Before he reached 1,000, the vile creature trembled slightly and giggled one last time, its grating voice full of doleful outrage. Then, the bizarre monstrosity shuddered and grew absolutely still. It was finally dead. Sonny couldn't help but grin slightly. Finally, all those coins are mine. As the heavenly chain rattled and groaned, the voice of the spell resounded above the hellish stone island. Its words sounded like music to his ears. You have slain a fallen devil, mordant mimic. Your shadow grows stronger. You have received a memory. Despite the torturous burden of the crushing, Sonny couldn't help but feel jubilant. Not only did he receive 8 shadow fragments and a powerful memory, he had also defeated a fallen devil all by himself, without even Saint providing him any help. The Black Knight, too, had been a fallen devil, so killing one solo meant a lot to Sonny. It was a poignant milestone that made him feel like all his hard work and all the vile things he had gone through were not for nothing. He was accomplishing his goal. Growing stronger. Of course, the mordant mimic was not as terrifying of a foe in battle as the guardian of the ruined cathedral had been. One was a creature that seemed to have been created solely for combat, while the other mostly relied on deceit and ambushing its prey to achieve victory. And yet, the chest fiend was by no means an easy foe. If anything, its devilish nature only made it that much more dangerous. Arg! As the Twisted Rock rose higher, the crushing struck at Sonny with even more dreadful force, making his mirth dissipate in a wave of miserable suffering. A muffled groan escaped from his lips. Endure, just endure a bit more. This hell is going to end soon. For now he had no choice but to keep suffering, wait, and stare at the distant silhouette of the ivory tower. The beautiful pagoda seemed so close now that he could almost imagine himself reaching out and encompassing it in his fist. With nothing else to do, Sunny summoned the runes and found the familiar cluster out of habit. Shadow Fragments, 223/2000. I wonder how many coins are in that damn chest. Would he be able to create the third core with their help? Shifting his gaze, Sunny found the runes describing his memories. A new one was now shown at the end of the list. His eyes glistened slightly as he concentrated on it and read the description. Memory Covetous Coffer. Memory Rank Ascended. Memory Tier IV. Sunny really couldn't believe his fortune. This was the second ascended memory of the fourth tier that he had acquired in a span of just a few days. Even without considering the main boon of the expedition, the miraculous coins, this journey had already proved to be incredibly fruitful. But what kind of a memory would the bizarre carnivorous chest leave behind? Curious, he read on. Memory Type Tool. A utility memory. While not as showy as armors and weapons, utility memories were the foundation of every awakened's arsenal. Take Sunny, for example. Some of his most precious memories were tools. Endless Spring, Ordinary Rock, Silver Bell, even Weaver's Mask. Excited, he tried to forget about the obliterating pressure of the crushing and concentrate on the runes. Memory Description. You are very strange, said Noctis. Why was his new friend so deathly afraid of chests? Why was he so timid and pale? Don't be afraid, these are just my treasure chests. They won't bite. Well. Except for this one. This one will eat you alive. Sunny blinked. That is interesting. So Noctis of the Sanctuary of Noctis was a person, after all. What's more, he or she had apparently been in possession of several treasure chests, including one that could eat people alive. Had the mordant mimic once been a pet of this Noctis? If so, what kind of a person would keep a fallen devil as a pet? Suddenly full of dread, Sunny continued to read. Memory Enchantments, Mendacious Coffer, Capacious Chest, Locomotive Chiffonier, Lurid Trunk. Sunny stared at the runes with a deadpan expression. What do all these words even mean? Struggling to understand the names of the enchantments, he wondered if the spell was having a stroke and shifted his gaze to the descriptions. Mendacious Coffer, Enchantment Description. This memory can mimic the form of any inanimate object. The size and intricacy of the simulacrum are dependent on the wielder's soul core capacity. Makes sense. I am sure that the mimic only assumed the form of a chest instead of being born created. As one, I wonder what kind of a shape I can currently manage, though. He studied the runes again. Capacious Chest, Enchantment Description. This memory is bigger on the inside. It can be summoned and dismissed while storing inanimate items. The size of the storage space, as well as the maximum weight of stored items, are dependent on the wielder's soul core capacity. Sunny suppressed the desire to grin. Yes, this was exactly what he needed right now. This enchantment solved the exact problem he was facing, the need to carry all the gold coins away before Twisted Rock was destroyed. Once again, luck was on his side. But that wasn't all. The ability to store items in the covetous coffer and then store the coffer in his soul sea opened up a sea of possibilities. In a sense, it was just like Effie's incredible bag, but better, the bag had to be carried around if there was anything inside of it, while the coffer could be stashed away until needed. And if so, could Sunny bring items from the dream realm to the real world with its help? He couldn't wait to find out. Thinking of all the money he would make, Sunny turned his attention to the remaining enchantments. Locomotive Chiffonier, Enchantment Description. This memory can move around and follow its wielder. Nice. That will solve the problem of having to carry all the items if I store too much inside. They are still going to weigh a ton after all. Lurid trunk, enchantment description. This memory will protect itself against potential thieves by eating them. Sunny blinked. That is a bit scary. I better remain on the good side of this bizarre memory, huh? Overall, he was incredibly happy with the covetous coffer. This new utility memory of his was simply fantastic. Not only was it capable of solving his current predicament, it would also make his future ventures into the dream realm much more comfortable and efficient. Not to mention the possibility of being able to bring soul shards into the real world with its help, and selling them there at a high price. Soul shards meant money, and money meant being able to purchase memories. With more memories at his disposal, Sunny would be able to bring Saint to 200 shadow fragments faster, which would hopefully make the two of them vastly more powerful. Now he just had to survive the crushing. He was almost ready to give up and turn into a shadow when the heavenly chain finally drew taut, stopping the rise of the twisted rock. One more deafening rattle rolled through the air, and then everything grew quiet. The crushing was at its peak now. Sunny was hurting terribly, but still able to withstand it. He just had to endure until the island entered the descent phase, and the pressure would slowly start to reduce. Sunny strained his chest and drew in a hoarse breath. Thank gods. However, before he could feel any relief, the whole island suddenly shuddered, and a strange piercing noise assaulted his ears. It sounded like the sound of metal being torn apart. Sunny's pupils widened. What was that? A moment later, a deafening roar of massive iron links being torn apart rolled over the entire island, which then lurched up by a few meters and suddenly came to an abrupt stop. Sunny yelped, feeling the crushing assault him with even more obliterating force. The chain is failing. Why did it happen so soon? For a few moments, he felt nothing but pure, bestial panic. Then, he forced himself to regain control over his mind and threw a desperate glance toward the not-so-distant edge of the twisted rock. Would he be able to escape in time? He lingered for a moment, then gritted his teeth and commanded one of the shadows to slide off his body onto the ground. As soon as it did, a muffled scream escaped from his lips. It felt as though a giant hammer struck his body, making every bone in it shudder and groan. Sunny turned his head to the side and spat a mouthful of blood. Curse it all. The shadow flew to the edge of the island and slid over its edge, desperately trying to reach the dying chain. But it was too late. As Sunny watched in horror, one of the links of the heavenly tether broke. Only one, the weakest of them all, but that was all it took. No! The chain that connected Twisted Rock to the rest of the chained isles snapped in two, and as 10 kilometers of gargantuan iron links slowly fell toward the sky below, the island suddenly shot upward. Since it was still in the ascent phase, and now unrestrained by anything, the speed of its rise was simply terrifying. No, no, no! The crushing struck at Sunny with such fury that he couldn't even scream. He felt himself being slowly broken, and feverishly tried to come up with a solution. Step through the shadows, jump down, and try to glide to the shipwreck island. No, that would never work. There were more than 10 kilometers separating these isles from one another, which was far outside the Dark Wing's capabilities. He could try to chase after the piece of the chain still connected to the shipwreck island, but chances of catching up with it were close to zero. The length of the heavenly tether was falling deceitfully slow, but it was just an illusion caused by its colossal size. In truth, the torn end of it was flying through the air at tremendous speed, moving both down and away from the twisted rock. The repulsive silhouettes of the gluttonous chainworms were growing smaller by the second. Sunny was already late to rush in pursuit of it, and every moment that passed made the probability of success lower. "Great, goddamn great, you fool. You finally let your greed kill you." Sonny growled, full of fury at himself, but then suddenly stopped. No, that didn't make any sense. He was not on this island because of greed. Even though Sonny had made several risky decisions in order to get to the miraculous coins, at the end of it, standing on the edge of the shipwreck island, he put his avarice aside and made a sober choice. He came here because his intuition had told him that something on the twisted rock was very important to his future. But what was it? There was nothing but stone and bones in this damned place. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to survive? Sonny tried to calm down and think. He summoned his shadow back and briefly regained the ability to breathe. It wasn't going to be for long, though. The crushing was already overwhelming his physical ability to resist its lethal pressure. Sonny had a few dozen seconds at most before he would be forced to retreat into the shadows or die. Think, there has to be a way out. Hide inside the dead mimic or the covetous coffer. No, the items inside the memory maintain their weight, which means that they too will be affected by the crushing. And even if not, what's the point? Even if the chest survives until the twisted rock itself is torn apart and plunges down into the sky below, I'll just be falling forever inside of a box, instead of on my own. That's like dying inside of a coffin. And the twisted rock was going to be destroyed by the crushing, inevitably and without a doubt. As it rose higher and higher, it was going to start to fall apart. When enough of it was destroyed to obliterate the mysterious force that kept the isles afloat, the remaining debris was going to fall down and eventually disappear into the sky below, alongside what was going to remain of Sonny. He lay motionlessly for a few seconds, then for a few seconds more. Another crack appeared on the corpse of the mordant mimic. Then the stone beneath it cracked too. Sonny did not move at all. The cracks on the stone widened and crawled in every direction. A few moments later, a heavy sigh escaped from his lips. Sonny had one last gamble left. Gathering all of his strength, he groaned and pushed himself off the ground. Even though it felt as if he was lifting a mountain, and every muscle in his body trembled at the edge of bursting apart, he somehow managed to sit up. Then Sonny summoned Weaver's mask. After returning from the forgotten shore and deciding to create a separate persona to investigate the sovereigns, as well as do all the things that Sonny didn't want to be associated with his name, the one which would then accidentally become known as the famous Lord Mongrel. He had decided to never use any of the equipment that it wielded if there was even the smallest chance of someone connecting him to the mysterious masked man. But he had little choice right now. His last hope was fate. He knew that something had drawn him to the twisted rock, even though in the end he failed to find it. In the past, his intuition only reacted that strongly to the things that were connected to the gods, the unknown, and Weaver. So there was a high chance that Weaver's mask would show him the way to salvation. As the cool black wood caressed his skin, Sonny forced air into his lungs and sent his shadow essence toward the mask. He was going to do something that he dreaded doing for many months. Activate the mysterious enchantment of the divine memory. When the power of his soul poured into the Weaver's mask, Sonny froze for a moment, and then let out a horrible, inhuman scream. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.